over longer periods of time. The changes are larger, so we want to find something that's going to be constant going forward.
After a quick metro trip across Paris, we make it to the Bureau de Poids Mesure, the BPIM, the home of the metric system. While the kilogram team drop off copy 18 and say their goodbyes, I catch up with Stefan Slamenyer, a physicist from the US National Institute of Standards and Technology.
You know, the fathers of the metric system, they always had this slogan, for all times, for all people. They fell short when it came to the kilogram. And I think this change that we're doing right now, we're going to use a fundamental constant, so every person can interrogate the universe and say, what is the value of this constant? And this is truly now for all times, because fundamental constants don't change anymore, hence the name. And it's for all people, because everybody can, in principle, ask the universe, what is the value of Planck's constant?
So how do we use Planck's constant then to weigh sugar in a supermarket, or, I don't know, weigh myself on the scales?
It seems at odd that we have a microscopic object, the kilogram, and that is compared to age, which comes out of quantum mechanics. Because quantum mechanics describes the really small physics. It's nothing to do with the kilogram. But what we can do is we use a device called a Kibble balance, and it compares mechanical power to electrical power. Then there are quantum mechanical effects that people have used electricity for the last 30 years. They can link electrical power to Planck's constant. So we go from the world of mechanics to the world of electrical measurements, and then from electrical measurements to quantum mechanics, and this is how we can link it all together.
All the physics may be completed, but everyone around the world is still using a lump of metal kept under lock and key in Paris. To change the definition of the kilogram and change the metric system, every country has to agree that the Planck constant is to be used instead.
Representatives of our 60 member states, representatives from our 42 associate states and economies, ladies and gentlemen. You've met here in Versailles at the 26th General Conference on Weights and Measures and have heard about the work of the National Metrology Institutes around the world to bring us to the position where it is possible to propose to revise the base units of the International System of Units, the SI.
Thank you. Now I will initiate the vote.
Alors, on commence avec Afrique du Sud, South Africa. I heard yes.
That was yes.
Allemagne, Germany.
Yes. A yes from Germany. Yes from Ukraine.
Uruguay.
A yes from Uruguay.
So
and now the announcement.
The vote was unanimous yes. I hope that such votes will also be possible for many other issues for the world. So thank you so much.
So I've just managed to find a quiet spot away from the throng of people downstairs to talk to Ian Robinson from MPL, who helped develop the Kibble balance with Brian Kibble.
Yep.
How do you feel after the momentous vote?
It feels really good. It means we can move from measuring the Planck constant to doing something positive with it.
Ian Robinson from the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, ending that report by Henry Benny. Finally today, last week we featured the Godfrey Report, a government assessment, amongst other things, of the efficacy of vaccinations and badger culling in an attempt to tackle tuberculosis. Needless to say, this is a controversial topic with lots of strong opinions on all sides, and we had stacks of correspondence on the matter, not all complimentary, and we thought it was worth revisiting bovine TB and badgers and trying to really get to grips with some of the science. I spoke to Malcolm Bennett, Professor of Zoonotic and Emerging Disease at the University of Nottingham. We had a long conversation. The full version is on the podcast, which I would recommend if this is a subject that really grinds your gears. You might want to save your emails till after you've listened to that. BBC Inside Science at bbc.co.uk is the address. Now, one of the things that we talked about last week was how the main transmission route for bovine TB was actually between cows. And I asked Malcolm how this actually happens.
Bovine TB in cattle is transmitted mainly by the respiratory route, so aerosols, and they get right down to the far end of the lungs. So Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex seem to like growing in the lungs. So once it's there, it's taken up like any bacteria that get into places they shouldn't be by macrophages. And of course the job of macrophages is to eat bacteria, kill them, and present the antigens on those bacteria to parts of the active immune response, so to T cells and B cells and that kind of thing. The trouble we have with mycobacteria is they grow in the macrophages. So what we have instead of dead bacteria is a slow growing mycobacterium that's growing inside the macrophages, and gradually that infection expands, but it's also being controlled a bit by the immune response, although it's not a brilliant immune response because it's hiding from the immune response inside the macrophages. So you end up with very small microscopic sites, I hesitate to call them lesions really, where there'll be some macrophages with dormant bacteria in them, some macrophages with growing bacteria in them. You'll have maybe a little bit of inflammation coming in because there was a bit of an immune response going on, and it can stay like that for months, years, in humans decades, hiding from the immune response, and we call that latent infection. So if you're a human, you might live like that for years, and then you might have some kind of a stress that knocks your immune system, so it might be HIV, it might be poor nutrition. Then your immune system can't handle the infection anymore, and it takes off, and the lesions get bigger and bigger, and when they're big enough you get clinical signs and eventually you die. Or it might be that your immune response beats the bacteria, in which case you can completely recover. Or if you're a badger, you probably get run over before any of that develops.
Right, I mean, it's a complex, sophisticated and pretty cunning bacterial disease. So we, in humans, all of us adults, bear the scar on our upper left arm of the BCG that we had when we were 12 or 13, I suppose. Yeah. So we give ourselves a boost, a vaccine, to help us identify and remain immunised against TB. How does the BCG work?
Okay, so BCG is an attenuated, a weakened, or if you like, knackered strain of Mycobacterium bovis. Nowadays we inject it. Originally it was given orally, and that makes an immune response which enables you to get a head start really on the real wild type infection if and when it happens.
And we've all got those scars, so how effective is it?
That's a big and a controversial question. So the figures that tend to be quoted are 70-80%, something like that, effective. But it depends on what species, what population, your background, history in disease, where you come from in the world, whether or not you're immunosuppressed, how good your nutrition is, and all that kind of thing. So in different studies, it ranges from about 80% down to no effect whatsoever. We don't know absolutely why we get such different responses to BCG in different populations at different times.
Right. So, you know, the picture gets even more complicated the deeper that we delve into it. We had a number of emails simply asking the question, well, rather than culling the badgers or vaccinating the badgers so that they don't transmit it to cattle, why don't we simply vaccinate the cows like we vaccinate ourselves?
So the simple and quickest answer is to say because it's illegal. And the reason for that is that we can control TB in cattle by testing them, and if they're positive, we cull them. So we look for an immune response, and we can't tell the difference between an immune response to the vaccine and an immune response to infection. So if we vaccinated our cows, next year we'd come back to test and cull the ones who were positive, and we'd end up culling all the ones we vaccinated last year.
In this era of genetics, where we get DNA out of thousands, millions of species with relative ease, is there not a method of trying to identify the DNA of the tuberculosis bacteria rather than looking for an antigen response?
Yes, and I guess the obvious way would be PCR, which is a very sensitive technique for detecting the DNA of anything. One of the problems with TB is that, well, first of all, you still got to get a sample that has the organism in, and secondly, the structure of the bacterium seems to make it quite difficult to get the DNA out, and as a result of all of that, PCR is nothing like as sensitive as we would hope it would be. There's another test that's being developed at the moment which makes use of bacteriophages, so these are viruses which infect bacteria. So there are specific ones which infect mycobacteria, and this test, so far, it looks to be very, very sensitive and very, very quick, but it's not been validated, and there is a lot more work that can be done before it can be completely rolled out.
Well, actually, one of our correspondents, William Streetfield, who is a dairy farmer from Somerset, now he asked a question which I think is worth addressing, that one of our guests mentioned last week, that Badger culls in some areas appeared to have the effect of increasing the prevalence of TB, especially in the first few years. But William points out that we didn't really cover the reason why. So Malcolm,